Welcome, everyone. I'm Heather Bradley, the Director of the Center for Nonprofit Resources, and I'm delighted to welcome you to another episode of C4NPR Chats. The Toledo Bar Association has partnered with the Center for Nonprofit Resources to find ways to connect local attorneys to local nonprofits. The participation of our expert today is made possible through that program, and I welcome Patti Wise.
Thanks so much.
Patti is an attorney at Spengler Nathanson, a local law firm here in Toledo. Patti is nationally known as a practitioner in the area of labor and employment law, and she has trained thousands in this area. Patti is certified by the Ohio State Bar Association as a specialist in the area of labor and employment law. Patti, I suppose before we jump in, should I check, are there any disclaimers you want to make before we start?
Sure, Heather, thanks. And I guess I would just say that what we're going to talk about today will be general advice and some ideas, hopefully some practical things that employers may want to consider. I can't give actual legal advice, of course, because I don't have an attorney-client relationship with any of the people who might be listening, but hopefully they'll find something that's useful in what we're talking about today.
Oh, I'm confident they would, and really appreciate the flexibility of the bar and of Patti to respond really quickly, because today's topic is really looking at legal and employment matters that may be impacting nonprofit leaders and their organizations in light of the circumstances around the coronavirus. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Patti, maybe you just talk about what you're seeing out in the employment landscape in relation to coronavirus.
Right. I think the main thing that we're seeing is the situation is so fluid that people are really having to react quickly. And I guess I should have added at the beginning, I'm certainly not giving any health advice or medical advice, but I do think that we're all really closely monitoring CDC updates, the WHO, and those kinds of things. And I think it's requiring employers to communicate much more frequently with employees. And even if employers are saying what seems to be almost the same message over and over, it does help to stay in communication with the employees. Everyone has questions. We don't all have answers or answers to all of the questions, but just to know that, everyone, especially employers, are trying to stay on top of it. I mean, I think the most recent change we saw was the closing of the schools in a lot of areas, certainly in Ohio. And that was a development that required quick response and will certainly require that of employees. So I think that's really the main thing we're seeing, is just the constant change and the need to be in touch.
Mm-hmm. And we can talk about some specific situations that may arise, but when you think about the role or the responsibilities of employers, are there certain areas that you are most concerned about or getting the most questions about?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern, and everybody is, working to keep their employees safe, to keep their families safe, those kinds of things. But I think the big concern, frankly, is one of cost, because there are many things that can be done in the workplace that employers have a right to do. But the bottom line is that both employers and employees are going to face some unanticipated expenses. People will have to be off work, either because their organization is shut down or because they themselves have a personal situation that requires quarantine or now caregiving for children who are maybe healthy but out of school. And, employees aren't, of course, going to have enough paid time for that, maybe not any paid time, or whatever paid time they have, they're not going to necessarily want to use that, especially when we're in March of the calendar year, which is how a lot of employers compute that. And we can't simply shift that cost to the employers. So, I'm hoping there will be some help from the government, maybe some assistance in terms of unemployment compensation, those kinds of things. But I think really that is an issue of great concern. So less the logistics that we can all make some good decisions about. We've got a lot of good advice, a lot of resources, and maybe more concern over time about the cost, really, for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Patti, I know that you have a lot of experience working with nonprofits of all different sizes, and
Yes.
certainly for the nonprofits that don't have an in-house HR person or don't have direct access to in-house counsel or outside counsel. Some specific things, and right now sitting here today, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, we're not in the same situation, but let's talk about a couple of scenarios from the legal perspective that could arise. So what do nonprofit leaders need to know legally as an employer if they have to shut down their operation?
Right. So employers really have a lot of rights in this regard. So if a nonprofit needs to be completely shut down, if they need to have a temporary shutdown, layoffs, maybe a certain department or area that could be discontinued, there needs to be a lot of thought around what are essential services, what are the kinds of things that have to be delivered. But that is entirely permissible anytime. So an employer always has that right to shut down, and it may be advisable in certain situations, certainly now. And in those situations, especially when there is a layoff or a shutdown, employees may be able to collect unemployment. So that could be helpful. Employees can be laid off at any time. So for reasons of the nonprofit's needs or the employee him or herself, needs at home, or maybe illness or exposure, those kinds of things. So employers have great leeway here. They can conversely not just require people not to come to the workplace, they can require employees to cancel vacation plans. So we don't think about that maybe first, but when you are offering some kind of essential services, and there is going to be now this concern about being able to do that with potentially employees out of the workplace, employers even have a right to require employees to cancel pre-approved vacation. Now, having said all that, having the right doesn't necessarily make that something that is palatable or even, maybe something that's employers are able to do. So we've still got that major issue, as I said, of is the time off paid or unpaid? And that's certainly when we're talking about nonprofits, we're not talking about employers who have, and no employer really has reserves for the extent of this potential situation. One thing they need to make sure is when employees are off in this situation, whether it's because of the employee's own circumstances or the employer's directive, there should be no attendance ramifications whatsoever. So there should be, if they have a point system, whatever it might be, no corrective action, no discipline attached to this. And now we know in Ohio, we're going to have children at home who need to be supervised. So that's just going to have to happen in whatever way is necessary. I've heard of some employers being proactive, helping their employees maybe get together so that, say, if 3 or 4 employees lived nearby, they could maybe share caregiving. So one employee might have kids at their house one day, and then kind of have a flexible work arrangement, kind of almost a work sharing. That is entirely within the rights and responsibilities of an employer. I don't know that that's feasible, but those kinds of really creative solutions might be a help. But the main thing is that there can be no discipline or corrective action for any attendance issues related to the pandemic. And then we just keep going back to that paid and unpaid issue, and where those resources, frankly, are going to come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up a couple of great technical points I'd like to just peel back a little bit more. So if a nonprofit has no experience of the technicalities of laying off an employee, the whole legal aspect of the processing, do you have any guidance or suggestions where they can go to get more information to ensure they're in compliance?
Right. So it's actually, at least logistically, it's very simple to do that. All that's required is just letting the employee know. And, again, I think communication is so important now. And it's okay for employers to say that maybe they don't know. They don't know how long a temporary layoff is going to be, rather than to say, we're closed through X date, if they don't know that. I think we all recognize that the situation is fluid. So just to communicate that, but really all that's required is to let the employees know. I would then, if there was going to be a shutdown or a layoff, I would direct the employees to the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services website in terms of unemployment benefits, because those might be available. And I'm hoping that we see that those are more widely available even than they are now. But I would direct employees to that website so that they can begin the process of applying for unemployment compensation in that situation. But employers don't have to worry at all about maybe they've heard of the WARN Act and those kinds of notices. They're not going to be applicable in this situation. So literally all that's required is just letting the employees know, letting them know what you do know and what the employer is, still kind of waiting to decide or waiting to find out about.
That's really helpful. And in the situation, so you've talked about flexibility. And one way that nonprofits could choose to be flexible, if it's practical, is to have employees working remotely. Now, we know a lot of the nonprofit staffs and volunteers are hands-on, and that's not possible. But if a nonprofit has never had a policy around, well, first of all, I assume you're going to advocate a policy, but if a nonprofit has never had a policy as it relates to remote work arrangements, what might you suggest to them?
Right. So about the policy, I think, we'll all probably have a lot more policies after we get through this pandemic than we have in the past. And that might be one. But in terms of remote work capabilities, the main thing I would say is to be careful to establish, and it doesn't have to be anything elaborate, but some kind of system to stay in communication with the employees so that hours can be tracked for those employees who are non-exempt. So if employees who are paid hourly, or even if they're salaried employees but are non-exempt, the employer needs to be sure that they can track the hours of that employee. And of course, we're on the honor system here once people are working remotely, but it can be as simple as, having the employee write those down at home, or send an email with the hours, or check in by phone, or, whatever communication system is best. Some organizations have, systems like Slack or something like that, but they need to be keeping track of hours, maybe in ways that they don't ordinarily do that, because the most important thing is to pay people properly when they are performing work, and that work is probably going to be performed differently or in different time spans when people are working remotely. And then I guess I would say too, for employees who have not in the past worked remotely, we can't assume that everyone has the ability to do that, even in terms of just internet access and hardware at home. So, it's really kind of a case by case situation, but the main thing will be to track those hours.
Yeah. So, FMLA, is there anything our nonprofit leaders need to know about how we anticipate FMLA will come into this? Sorry, for those who don't know, Family Medical Leave Act.
Right, and that's going to apply. The Family Medical Leave Act is going to be applicable to those nonprofits with 50 or more employees, and they're probably well aware of that requirement already. So a couple of things. It is very clear that anyone who is affected by the virus and now caring for someone perhaps with the virus will qualify for FMLA. This will be considered a serious health condition. And the one thing that will be different about the process, and for those nonprofits who are already complying with FMLA, they know that there is a fair amount of documentation. The one piece of the documentation that will change is that, and I am always recommending to employers that they get the proper certification from the employee's healthcare provider, and that's the thing that will change. We will not be doing that. What we don't want is to require employees to get that healthcare certification that they ordinarily would to say that they have a qualifying serious health condition. So we're not going to require that because we've all heard we don't need to be sending people necessarily to doctors or the emergency room. And we're going to be accepting employees at their word. And that is just the situation. And then the employer should comply with all of the rest of the documentation requirements. So all of the other forms that are ordinarily used, those will stay the same. It's just that one exception.
So Patti, we've covered a lot of ground already. What have we not yet talked about that you want to ensure that nonprofit leaders are aware of in the context of this new environment?
Yeah, I guess maybe, when we think about, especially nonprofits who are offering those essential services and even maybe working particularly with at-risk populations, the most important thing, and this is true for everyone, for all of us as we go about our days, the CDC precautions, and following those to the best of the employer's ability, and really emphasizing that and reminding employees that, sure, and we know we should wash our hands, but it doesn't hurt to have the signs posted. It doesn't hurt to remind people of that. To the extent that hand sanitizers and disinfecting sprays are available, we really should do what we can to support those CDC precautions. Employers can actually give employees cleaning responsibilities. So employees who might never, think about cleaning, and that might be done by, other employees or an outside service, we can actually require that employees clean their workspace, clean their shared break areas at certain times. We can require documentation of that. We can require it at regular intervals, all of those kinds of things. But here's, I guess, what I would say to keep in mind. If an employee refuses to do certain work. So say maybe the example of a nonprofit that's in direct contact with at-risk population. The employer cannot discipline an employee for raising a safety issue, and they cannot retaliate against an employee for doing so. Now, what the backstop is, if you will, in terms of providing those essential services is if a reasonable employee would consider the assignment safe, then an employee's refusal is not protected. So in other words, if we're in the service is providing something to an at-risk population, or it's having more contact than, the social distancing that's being recommended, employees can be asked to do that, and it's reasonable to do so. And it's also helpful to provide whatever is appropriate for the situation. Again, gloves, hand sanitizer, those kinds of things. But if an employee refuses to do that, they really should not be disciplined for the refusal, or for, we certainly can't retaliate against them if it is still part of the reasonable services that a nonprofit would provide. And I think we have to be, again, this is just a flexible individual situation. We have to be understanding of employees who are going to have anxiety about the situation. And that's why, again, that communication is so important, and just staying in communication, talking with individual employees, those kinds of things.
Well, Patti, on behalf of our nonprofit community, I can't tell you how appreciative we are that you've taken the time to share this information with us, again, particularly those groups that don't have access to an HR professional or outside or inside counsel. So a very special thank you to Patti for sharing her time and experience with all of you, and to the Toledo Bar Association for helping to make this C4NPR chat possible. And Patti, you're welcome back anytime if you think that something has changed and it's important to push the information out to our community.
Great. Well, thank you so much for providing the service. It's really helpful.
Great. Thank you.